Before we start, I want to let you know that the episode this week is going to be a two-parter, as my conversation with Scott was just too good to cut. So please come back next week to catch the second half. Today's guest is Scott Weiss. He is the co-founder and chief creative officer at Catalest, and he's also a former White House Presidential Innovation Fellow. He supported the VA and the OMB, both really great organizations that do a lot of work in that in the space that he's interested in, and I'll let Scott talk about that. And he's also worked at IDEO. So anybody who's familiar with that organization, which I'm sure he can also expound on as we talk about his past and things that he's done. So thank you very much for joining me today, Scott.
Thanks, Jeremy. Glad to be here.
So for those who have not met you, had a chance to interact and hear about your background, even people who have met you
Yeah,
have not all heard this background we're going to talk about today. Just wind the wheels back and talk about where you're from, who you are, and what you do.
yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So I was one of those rare 16-year-olds that knew exactly what they wanted to do. I fell in love with filmmaking and TV production as a teenager, and that was sort of the catalyst that drove me to pursue an education in film studies and communications. That kind of catapulted me to Syracuse University, where I dove deep into that education, and all that did was really ignite my interest further in pursuing a career in the entertainment industry. So after I graduated, I took about 15 minutes, pack my things, New York, and move out to Los Angeles to start my first career and my new life out there. And I don't know, Jeremy, if you had a similar experience in your 20s right after college, but there's a sort of fantasy career that you imagine for yourself based on what you hope it will be. And then there's the actual day-to-day reality of it. And for me, while there was a lot of really compelling and exciting aspects of the entertainment industry, I also felt right away that culturally it was quite competitive and really challenging to kind of navigate a lot of the inner workings of the entertainment industry. And this sort of entertainment industry executives have a sort of euphemistic term for Hollywood, this sort of rite of passage. They call it Hollywood grad school, which is where you sort of have to be an assistant and kind of, you know, learn the ropes that way. And I consistently had pretty terrible bosses along the way, and every now and then got like glimmers of really exciting opportunities, but felt like I was pretty consistently trying to put a square peg into a round hole professionally. I worked at Paramount for a few years, which again, very bittersweet. I got to work on a studio a lot, which is really exciting, but the day-to-day toxicity of my working environment sort of outweighed, I would say, the joy I felt in actually making movies. And granted, that's not true for everyone. I had a lot of friends who experienced their careers in the entertainment industry in a much different way. So this is really just my lived experience. Um, and then from my experience at Paramount, I transitioned to TV production. Again, sort of a bit more of a deviation. I was working in the reality television
Mm.
production world. And at that point, I was in my late 20s. I felt like I had deviated pretty far from my dream, and wasn't really feeling inspired in the way that I wanted to, wasn't really learning much anymore. Frankly, I didn't love living in Los Angeles anymore. And I think putting those three things together, putting that all on a scale, really forced me to reflect more deeply on the type, not only the type of career I wanted, but the type of people I wanted to be surrounded by every day. In one fell swoop, at 29, I quit my job. I, broke up with a partner I was in a serious relationship with at the time, and called a friend in San Francisco and asked him if I could start my life over in San Francisco without a plan. I knew that I needed reinvention. and I knew I couldn't do that in LA anymore, and felt like at least a venue change would be, meaningful enough, and I think enough of a stimulus to give some sort of direction. And so I left LA in 2010. Geez, 2010, with a lot of curiosity about what my life and career would look and feel like. I assessed as part of this transition, took a deep hard look at not just what I didn't want to do, but what I was good at,
Mm.
right? And how those skills that I had kind of acquired over 7 years in the entertainment industry could at least translate into a narrative that I could shape and leverage to, incentivize employers to hire me. And I guess, looking back on that process, I realized two key things about my life and my skills. One was I love storytelling, right? That was consistent no matter what I was working on in Hollywood. I loved really good storytelling and knew what good looked like from a storytelling standpoint. Um, and the other thing I was really good at, which I actually kind of learned in film school, was that I was a really good producer
Mm.
and a really good project manager. And so those things combined, I think, led to an opportunity to amplify those things as I was looking for new opportunities. So when I got to San Francisco, I cast a really wide net. I met with a lot of. I was redesigning my life, so I felt like the best way I could do that, and the lightest lift was just to talk about my life and talk about what I had learned, throughout my 20s, and see if there was chemistry there with prospective employers. I met with, the most one-to-one, at least in San Francisco at the time, were ad agencies. They were, translating content into packaged products.
Right.
And I met with ad agencies, and those conversations were terrible. They were like very reminiscent culturally of what I didn't like about LA. So I sort of pivoted, from there, and as luck would have it, I would say 3 months into my journey, engaging in lots of conversations about different opportunities, I met with a recruiter who saw my resume and saw my cover letter as not just this black and white kind of checklist. She saw it as a really compelling story that could be molded to specific context that she was very familiar with, which was design.
Mm.
Um, so she and I had many conversations, and the first conversation we had was about a company that I didn't even know about at the time, called IDEO. And she had said to me that they're always looking for project managers. I don't know if this is like the one-to-one, opportunity that I think you were exploring. But I know in my heart, like, these are your people, right?
Yeah.
This community that, represents IDEO is comprised of really interesting, dynamic, curious people that are, really bring a lot of ambition to problem solving.
Mm.
And she said, just take this interview. Let me know if you enjoy the conversation, then we can go from there. And you know, um, much to my delight and surprise, I went on that first interview. IDEO's offices, at least at the time, in the Bay Area, there were two. The one I interviewed at was the San Francisco studio, and it was, on the Embarcadero, overlooking the bay.
Mm.
I was there. It was like the sun was setting over the bay,
Wow.
and and it was one of those, the environment. It was like on a pier, and it looked like an adult kindergarten. It was like, really scrappy and dynamic, and inviting, and just being in that space, at least for that very first time, my heart exploded. And being, enveloped in these conversations with these really interesting people, I think gave me a compass for the first time in a long time. And so because this organization um, is it's tough to get hired at. It's one of the most successful, renowned design and innovation consultancies in the world. They're very consensus driven from a hiring
Oh, wow.
perspective, and so it took about 7 to 10 more interviews, I would say, until there was you know uh, a real pathway to my hiring. Um, and and yeah, so on the other end of that process, almost 6 months to the day of moving to San Francisco, the recruiter called me and said, "Congratulations, um, you can start your new life in San Francisco." And I felt a sense of like utter relief and joy. And yeah, and for those listeners who are unfamiliar with IDEO, just to kind of share a bit more about their history and story. So they're kind of responsible for popularizing what we now know today as human-centered design as a mechanism to solve really complicated challenges of all sorts. It's the same process that can be used across many contexts. And um, the origin story, it's depends on who you ask, but in the late 70s, early 80s, a gentleman by the name of David Kelly and Bill Moggridge sort of got together to work with Steve Jobs on a few of the early Apple products. And what Steve asked of David Kelly and Bill Moggridge was to help him better understand how human beings could interact with technology
Mm.
in a more dynamic, compelling, and human-centered manner. And so they sort of brought together this human-centered approach to industrial design and product design. And out of that came the first personal mouse for Apple computers, and a whole new discipline of design called interaction design. And over time, that methodology was used to support all sorts of challenges. And so I'll pause there, Jeremy. I don't know if you have any
Yeah, no, that's
reactions or
really
builds.
interesting because
Yeah.
there are many people who may not even know what human-centered design is. So that was a very good introduction to it. I'm a big fan
Yeah.
personally, but
Yeah.
um, I would say it's it's very interesting to me the risk you took, right, to
Mhm.
finish one career, put it in the bag, pack it up, move to San Francisco, which in itself, from many people who haven't lived there, it's very expensive. I mean, we know about Silicon Valley being just outside of San
Yeah.
Francisco and whatnot. I lived in Northern California for a short while, and
Yeah.
it's not an inexpensive place to be. Thankfully, you had a friend and then this opportunity. So no, I think this is fascinating that it's a 6 month process, a consensus process. I liked that it's a consensus.
Hmm.
I like to think that I do hiring in similar fashions with
Yeah.
panels of peers and feedback, right? Because it is about that team dynamic, which it sounds like they're very protective of.
Yeah, really well said. And to the first point around taking the risk, first of all, thank you for saying that. I uh, I agree. It is hard, no matter what your situation, to take a step back and reflect on whether or not the career that you're enveloped in is sparking joy and adding value. And and frankly, not a lot of people even have the luxury to be able to take that sort of beat to really reflect on what's working well and what's not. And I felt like I had enough financial stability at the time to at least give myself 6 months of unpaid sort of introspection and exploration to figure it out. And worst case scenario, um, I'd be okay. And so I think I took all of that into account. My parents were terrified and like really confused by that choice, because I think, and a lot of 20 somethings probably feel this way. It wasn't until my late 20s when I finally had financial stability and like, an executive status and like all of these things that I think were on some level hard to actually let go of. And so it took a lot of you know uh, internal conversations to like really take that leap. But once I did, it was the best decision I ever made in my adult life. Um, and then to the hiring thing, I totally agree. I think if you want to engineer a really meaningful culture and dynamic culture, I think it requires rigor,
Hmm.
right, and discipline. Um, IDEO, I think, is an extreme case, and I think what also makes it so special, despite it being so hard to get hired there, is they really look to diverse. They take a diversity approach to hiring. Not necessarily, if you look at their track record, it's not necessarily in terms of racial diversity, although they have that. There's a ton of gender diversity, but really in terms of background and area of expertise,
Hmm.
because human-centered design on its surface is a really, potent, problem-solving methodology, but it's really the team that you assemble
Hmm.
around that process really needs to be an interdisciplinary team so that you're all bringing different perspectives. Myself, a former, reality television producer, was one small piece of a much bigger team that included behavioral economists, anthropologists, graphic designers, industrial designers. And the idea is that we would all be coalescing around this fixed process and learning together, so we're not over biasing, you know, the or over influencing the process. We're, based on our diverse backgrounds, we're bringing, our respective lenses to this, and I think that really helped lead to, really impressive, innovative solutions and products and services that we worked on. Um, and it just made the process more interesting to be working with people who are bringing such compelling backgrounds to the process.
So then from there, San Francisco, I happen to know you're not in San Francisco anymore. How did
Yeah,
you end up back on the East Coast?
yeah. So 7 years at IDEO, I got to work on, you know hundreds of design projects spanning public sector, private sector, product design, organizational design, which was mostly became my bread and butter. So it's sort of IDEO's version of change management consulting, which is like going into complicated organizations and helping those organizations become more customer centered, human centered, more innovative in whatever way that meant for their sort of ecosystem. Um, and then towards the very end of my time at IDEO, I was introduced to this design discipline called systems design,
Hmm.
which was like this eye-opening, mind-blowing opportunity, because it was really all about looking at how kind of interconnected systems influence human experience. And I got to work on, this is totally true, Jeremy, I got to work on a project that was really focused on reimagining the aging and dying experience in American society. And at its core, the work was really about how we might bring sort of communities together, community leaders, industry leaders together to organize more effectively around identifying the problem and then sort of collaborating on meaningful, uh, systemic change in order to solve those problems. So for me, I got this bug, right, where all I wanted to do from a professional standpoint was work that sat at the intersection of human-centered design and social impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't get to at IDEO. You don't always get to choose what project you work on. You worked on, so I really wanted to take everything I had learned as a sort of senior design lead in the Bay Area, and you know, try my hand at an entrepreneurial sort of pathway. And, I'd been in California for 14 years at that point. I am from the East Coast. I'm from New York originally, and really wanted to be closer to my folks who were getting older themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and wanted to, be more, geographically close to them. And so it was a no-brainer going back to New York. And once I sort of settled, similar to my transition from LA to San Francisco, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I knew what I was good at. I knew what I loved, and I knew that things would be okay. And so there was an IDEO studio in New York, and I had met with a designer there who was sort of going through that same process as I was going through. And she and I got together and talked about co-founding a social impact and innovation consultancy.
Hmm.
So where do you start from there? We had the name, Community by Design, and we had our first client. It took a few conversations, but we were introduced to a an amazing person at the New York City mayor's office who was leading an R&D arm of the mayor's office called Civic Hall Labs. And she was interested in partnering with a design firm to help her think about creative ways for the mayor's office to bridge the sort of thriving tech community of New York City with underserved communities.
Hmm.
And so how might we sort of effectively organize these communities around innovation and design challenges? Historically, the New York City Mayor's Office and Call Labs have had sponsored like a hackathon, but the hackathon, I don't know if you've ever experienced those. It's a bunch of like really smart nerds, and engineers in a room just talking to each other,
Right.
and it wasn't a really inclusive space. And what we were exploring with Mayor De Blasio's office was, what if we actually physically brought those two communities together, and taught them all human-centered design, and use human-centered design as a way for these engineers and technologists to learn from these communities, so that on the other side of this process they would actually be delivering products and services that met their needs.
Hmm.
They would develop empathy for, and that's really the sort of secret sauce of human-centered design, is you, as it's a requirement, you can't fully understand or appreciate a challenge unless you are empathizing with the users who are navigating all of the pain points associated with the systems and services. So that was a big hit. On the other side of these workshops, some of the more attractive ideas and viable ideas were put into an accelerator program,
Hmm.
and so they were funded and then launched. And from there it was sort of a domino, the first domino that fell, that led to many more projects for our firm. We work with the UN on some sustainable tourism initiatives. We work with a bunch of universities to help them sort of build infrastructure for social impact projects and initiatives. We worked with a lot of nonprofits, and then from there, um, I think both of us were starting to feel a little burnout and curious about what the next step was. And so, similar to my previous chapter and the chapter before that, started thinking about what's next, and how I could sort of take all of these ingredients and experiences and apply them to a new challenge, a new experience. And um, I had met someone during that era, who kind of arbitrarily at a dinner party, who um, had just gone through a really interesting program that I briefly heard about years earlier, but had forgotten about it. And he had just gone through a full cycle of it, and it was called the White House Presidential Innovation Fellowship. And he asked some really good questions about what I had been up to and what I was thinking about. And he encouraged me to apply, because for a few reasons. One was, I had no idea about how federal government worked.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so interested in it. And it felt like there were so many barriers to doing work with the federal government that it never felt and like an accessible sort of, at least from a consulting standpoint, an accessible, community. Um, and even sort of more and more rudimentary level, I just didn't know that much about how government works. I think it's a failure of our civics education system. But I was really curious to learn more, and another reason was my friend, my new friend at the time, now a very close friend. He was like, "You realize there's no greater lever for social change in American society than federal government." And I was like, "Oh, right, of course."
Right.
And he was like, "This is a program that will give you access to some really complicated challenges that federal government is trying to solve." And so you would almost be an embedded advisor to federal leaders through this fellowship program. And and just backing up, the origin story of this program is really fascinating. I don't know how familiar you are with it, Jeremy, but in 2012, as I'm sure a lot of listeners will remember, um, the Obama administration had just passed the Affordable Care Act, which is like monumental legislative achievement. And then after that happened, they're like, "Oh, wait, now we have to build something that and will now enable people to be able to, apply for affordable healthcare insurance through this exchange portal." And so they're like, "How do we do that?" So they, you know, um, undertook this really expansive sort of project, and on the other side of it, they launched healthcare.gov, and it crashed immediately, and it was this, embarrassing
Mm-hmm.
failure in modern government history, and it forced federal government to really reckon with the fact that not was it just not innovative or modern, it was just not meeting the basic needs of American citizens through the products and services it delivered. And a mantra that I keep hearing in government, which is proven to be pretty true, is change comes with crisis often. And this was a real crisis moment in modern government history. And so they, it was kind of all hands on deck to fix this thing. And the chief technology officer, the White House, reached out to friends in industry at Google,
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft, and brought them in to work with him and his team on just a triage project. And they, you know, through lots of collaboration, were able to bring the system back online and deploy a viable product. And you know, um, during in the aftermath of that experience, the Obama administration, felt that, no duh, what if we worked with industry more intentionally on modernization challenges? And so they built something called the White House Presidential Innovation Fellowship, and use that as a mechanism to bring, senior advisors with, you know, lots of experience in all sorts of fields, mostly, technology and product design, to come in and do this kind of tour of duty. So I was lucky enough to have been brought in for the eighth cohort, I think, in 2019, and was detailed. Every fellow gets detailed to a specific agency for a year or two to work with their leadership on a variety of challenges. So I'm going to pause there. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have reactions to that, or if you remember kind of
Yes.
what that was.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I would say no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, the Obama administration did bring, both with that program, with the digital services
Yeah.
initiatives, with the cloud first, and there was so many policies that came out of that administration that were very future focused modernization. How can we do government better? And they're still going, and they still have long ranging impacts. I think GSA's 18F experiment, I think, came out around the same time. So yeah, I actually work in federal government, so I'm very familiar with a lot of
Yeah,
those programs and those things, and take advantage of some of those things. So I'm pleased that you have that background, so we can better highlight uh,
yeah,
that as an opportunity for that the government needs very smart people such as yourself to apply for
thank
those
you.
programs and come work with government in ways we would never consider. None of us have a background like you have, right? Many of us are career
Yeah,
realm, right? And then you'll have the administrative level political appointees who come in on a per administration basis. So there's lots of turnover every so many years, right? So I think that fresh injection of talent and ideas has certainly helped to make government,
yeah.
reevaluate itself.
Well said. Yeah, here, here. To the first point that you mentioned, which was, I kind of guessed that going into federal government. I did have some assumptions, most of which were challenged. But my biggest takeaway from the experience was that innovation is nonpartisan, right? Everyone agrees, whether you're right of center or left of center, that government should be more modern. And you can define modern and innovative in many different ways, but I think that we all collectively agree that government should, whether it's through the programs it designs and delivers, or the services it delivers, that it should be a more seamless experience. And so much so, this is 100% true. PIF was, so the acronym for White House Presidential Innovation Fellowship is PIF. It was signed into law in 2016 as part of the Talent Act, literally the last thing Obama signed into law before he literally is walking out of the White House. Like he didn't have the special ceremonial pen, so someone handed him a bic to sign this legislation, but it had passed 100-0.
Yeah,
I mean, how often has that happened in American history?
right. Very rare.
Not often. So to your point, it's a really apolitical issue, and I was so inspired by not just like the PIF cohort. Obviously, they're all great people, and I was kind of familiar with their world, having come from industry. But all the federal leaders and all of the communities surrounding them were some of the most brilliant, dynamic, engaging um, leaders and innovators, frankly, that I've had the pleasure of collaborating with, and just being, immersed in this sort of ethos of public service was transformative, and it really got me excited about, continuing on this journey of working with and behalf of and on behalf of federal leaders and public servants. Um, and that was really sort of uh, reinforced throughout all the project work I got to do as a PIF. I think Jeremy, you mentioned at the top. So I was the beneficiary of a lot of great projects. But the first one I worked on was with the VA, supporting a shared services organization within the enterprise called the Veterans Experience Office. And for all the listeners, like, this is one of my favorite government stories of every story I've heard in the past, 5 years or so since I came into public service. Like, that you can sort of trace back to this moment and sort of government history that led to what we now know as the sort of design and customer experience movement that's been, heavily invested in, can be
Mhm.
traced back to this story.
Wow.
So in 2016, I told this story recently at a workshop, so it's fresh, but it's well documented. There was a VA medical center in Phoenix that was as part of its mandate, and all the um, medical centers mandate had to report data to Congress about the wait times that veterans were experiencing waiting for their appointments. And this is totally true. They were falsifying the data that they were submitting to Congress. And, as a result, when the actual data was, far off, they realized that veterans had to wait so long for their appointments that in some cases they were dying. And so it created this, scandal, understandably. There were congressional hearings, and the secretary resigned as a result of those hearings. And I mentioned never, out of crisis comes opportunity earlier, and change. And so the VA, as the sort of lead agency now, is under a microscope. We're like, we're not meeting the needs of veterans. How do we reimagine ourselves to be a more sort of human-centered organization?